we will introduce our next speaker now, Margie. Mr. Andrew Keene.
Yeah.
What do we know about Mr. Andrew Keene, Margie?
Well, because there's a lot of hate and disinformation, a lot of important issues are buried in public conversation. So Andrew Keene will talk more about that. He is the author of 4 books: The Cult of the Amateur, Digital Vertigo, the international hit The Internet is Not the Answer, and How to Fix the Future.
And actually, this isn't the first time that we've heard about
He's not.
Mr. Andrew
Yeah,
Keene.
he's a returnee.
6 years ago, he actually flew here in the Philippines for our Think PH, the Internet Big Data Youth Summit. And he gave a talk about how the internet was, quote, an epic failure. Epic failure ang internet ka, Marge.
The Tinder profile, I don't know.
Wow. For him, the internet has not aged well and has only benefited a small group of people. If this continues, the future will soon be unfixable. Today, we would like to hear what he thinks about the many things that happened and did not happen in the years that passed.
Okay, so in his latest book, How to Fix the Future, Keene comes a long way from pointing out the cultural and societal dangers the internet poses. So mas positive na siya ngayon to finding real solutions to bigger problems concerning the digital future.
So again, our next speaker, Mr. Andrew Keene.
Well, thank you for such a nice introduction. I think actually last time I came, I described the internet not just as a, what did you say? Epic failure. I called it an epic fucking failure, but I don't know if you're allowed to swear in the Philippines. And I've never spoken after a panel about plastic, but it occurred to me that plastic is the problem of the 20th century. You still need to clean it up, of course. The equivalent of plastic in the 21st century is data. And when it comes to pollution and the environmental challenges of the 21st century, of the digital century, there is, of course, physical pollution, and there are physical environmental issues, not the least of which is global warming. But the greatest of all the issues, the environmental issues, I think, of the 21st century will be data and the trashing up of our world, of our minds, and our environments. So my last book was called How to Fix the Future, but the title of this speech is How to Fix Democracy. I'm actually working on a book and a movie now, and I interviewed Maria for it, and she was my star interviewee. I'm not just saying that because I'm here. She's a brilliant woman, a brave woman, and also incredibly articulate when it comes to the impact of the digital revolution on democracy, or the lack of democracy. So what I'll try and do is connect up the challenges to the future and democracy, because I think that maybe 6 years ago it was less obvious to explicitly connect the impact of technology, not just on business and on culture and media, but also on politics. 6 years ago, of course, there was no Donald Trump, there was no Cambridge, well, there was a Donald Trump, but there was no President Donald Trump, there was no Cambridge Analytica. The forces of disinformation all over the world, here, in Russia, in Europe, in the United States, they existed, but they were less obvious. And the growth of what we might think of as this kind of neo-authoritarianism, very different from the totalitarianism of the 20th century, but just as corrosive in its own way for democracy, was much less obvious. So the rise of neo-authoritarian leaders, whether it was Orban in Hungary, Trump in the United States, Duterte in the Philippines, many other leaders around the world, Bolsonaro in Brazil. 6 years ago, this phenomenon didn't exist. Today, we're confronted with a real crisis of democracy. I interviewed perhaps the world's prominent scholar of democracy, Stanford University's Larry Diamond, for my movie as well. And he describes the current state of democracy as being a deep recession. It's not a depression yet. We're not back in the 1930s. But he feels that that deep recession may indeed turn out to be a depression if we don't address it now. I'm going to talk about the relationship between technology and digital technology and today's crisis of democracy around the world. But let me begin with a caveat. I think it's all too easy to blame everything on technology. I think I've been guilty of that in the past. And there are other forces which are undermining democracy in the world today. Not the least is globalization, a kind of unregulated capitalism, what some people would call neoliberalism. So to blame everything on technology, I think, would be as crass, as idiotic, as to argue that technology is the solution to everything. I think the challenge we have in the digital 21st century is balancing a view of technology, recognizing, as with industrialization, as with the plastic revolution, that it brings both benefits and problems to our society, to humanity. And that's the challenge with technology. So I'm not here today to tell you that the only reason why we have a current crisis of democracy around the world, a deep recession, is because of the internet and digital technology and social media. But I am here to explain why I think technology is playing an important role and why there is no coincidence that this current crisis of democracy has gone hand in hand with the digitalization of society. I think the key date for historians always look back and find a date for the beginning of a new century. I think the beginning of the 20th century was 1914 and the outbreak of the First World War. The beginning of the 19th century may have been the French Revolution. I think the beginning of the 21st century was 1989. Now, most people associate 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the undermining of communism and totalitarianism in Eastern Europe. But of course, in 1989, we also know that a few hundred miles southwest of Berlin, in the Swiss city of Geneva, a British scientist, a research scientist, a young man called Tim Berners-Lee, invented the World Wide Web. And it's these two events, I think, which coincidentally happened a few hundred miles apart and a few months apart in 1989, that mark the beginning of our new century. Now, I'm along with being a filmmaker and a writer, I'm also an entrepreneur, failed one. I'm also probably a failed writer and filmmaker. I think if you do all those things, inevitably you're a failure. But I began my life in digital technology as an entrepreneur, as a startup guy in the 90s, like so many other people who have been involved in this digital revolution, perhaps in some ways like Maria, although I don't think she happened to find herself in San Francisco in the mid-90s. I happened to be in San Francisco. I was a journalist, a music journalist, and I was really excited by the potential of technology to democratize society. And that's what in part drove me to become an entrepreneur. That's what in part drove me to dedicate my working life to digital technology as an entrepreneur and then later as a writer and a critic. I thought, like so many other people in the mid-90s, like Berners-Lee, when he invented the World Wide Web in 1989, and indeed, in a remarkable display of generosity, the epitome of civic responsibility, he gave the World Wide Web away. He gave it to all of us. That's why, in a sense, it's free now. That's why you don't have to pay anything, at least in terms of getting onto the World Wide Web. But we all thought that this technology would democratize. We were excited by its potential in 2 or 3 profound ways. The first way we believed, we being, and I'm speaking on behalf of the sort of pioneering entrepreneurs and evangelists of the digital revolution, we believe that if we gave technology to the people, if we gave these platforms as a manifestation of self-expression, if everyone could tweet and put their data on Facebook and put their music up on the internet and express themselves and blog and do all the other things that we all now do on the internet, this would be a good thing for democracy. Because after all, in the past, in the 20th century, the only people able to express themselves to the world were the owners of the media means of production, the owners of the New York Times and the BBC and the magazines and music studios, the music labels and movie studios that controlled the world's media. So by giving everyone the opportunity through this remarkably, it seemed to us, democratizing technology, suddenly we could all become journalists, we could all become filmmakers, we could all become musicians, we could all become commentators. Twitter is, of course, the perfect manifestation of this. As they're running this competition during the breaks, anyone can go on Twitter, anyone can express themselves, and there are millions of people on Twitter at any given moment of the day who can receive that information. We also thought that this technology would undermine the power of big media, of the curators, of the gatekeepers, who we thought were undermining democracy, who were bringing their own biases, their agendas, their economic interests and culture to the table. So we thought that the breaking down of these gatekeeping roles of old media would be good for democracy. It would enrich it. And we also thought that this technology would do away with parochialism, that this technology, as Berners-Lee so brilliantly described it, as the World Wide Web. We can be here in Manila, and at the click of a button, people in Manchester and Moscow all have access to the same information at the same time. When you tweet here, your friends or neighbors or followers all over the world have access to that information. So we thought that democracy would be internationalized, that we would do away with the localism, the parochialism of the 20th century. So not only would technology deepen, enrich, and democracy, but it would bring a new kind of enlightenment, the promise of enlightenment, of course, which has always been a feature of European civilization since the 18th century. This idea that knowledge, information, would be better for the world, because the more people online, the more people who would share data and facts, the more that data, that information would be purified, and the better it would be ultimately for truth. Truth would win out. So the more data, the more opinion, the more people online, the more data information would be filtered, the more end product would be truth. Now, as a matter of interest, those were the ideals: democratization, the purification of information and truth, the internationalization of culture, the democratization of opinion, the doing away with curators. Has democracy been enriched over the last 25 years? Are we living in a more democratic world? I'd be curious as to your opinion on this. How many people believe that democracy has benefited from all this technology? And how many of you don't? Whoops, and most of you didn't hear the question or don't have an opinion. Now, let me again be clear here. It would be absurd for me to stand here and claim that all this technology hasn't in some ways benefited technology. It has. By just having Twitter, we all now can express themselves. We know the way in which these platforms have played a role in challenging autocracies, in challenging unrepresentative governments around the world. The one that comes to mind most of all, of course, is the Arab Spring, which was a failure, and perhaps the role of technology there wasn't coincidental in its failure, but also important, credible movements like Black Lives Matter, like the women's movement now, the Me Too movement around the world, which is pushing back against the kind of sexualized culture and exploitation of women. And we know through platforms like Rappler, which are extremely valuable, more people have more access to information than they did before the digital revolution. So I'm not here just with bad news. I'm not here to tell you that the digital revolution has had no role in democracy. But I do feel that for the most part, it's failed. And let me specify in 2 or 3 areas. The first thing we assumed was that this technological revolution would create a new kind of level playing field when it came to technology companies, that the World Wide Web in Berners-Lee's idealistic vision would not only democratize information, but democratize business. That more and more companies would control and sell products that enabled the digital revolution, that put the tools of media consumption, of production in our hands. The reverse, of course, is true. Now, I'm not saying that Google or Facebook are bad companies or run by bad people. Some are worse than others, some are more idealistic than others, some are more honest than others. But I don't think that they're intrinsically bad. However, the reality of this digital revolution is that we have a winner-take-all economy in which a tiny group of companies now dominate the entire digital space. So when you look at Apple, and particularly Facebook and Google and Amazon, you have companies now with Microsoft, which are the most powerful and largest in the world. They control the so-called platforms of our new digital age. This has not benefited democracy. Capitalism, indeed, digital capitalism, or what Shoshana Zuboff calls surveillance capitalism, is much less democratic in the 21st century than it was in the 20th century, and it wasn't very democratic in the 20th century. We have then the consolidation of power. These platforms are owned. They're private companies. They've destroyed public space. They're seen as public space. But when you go on Twitter and when you go on Facebook, you're on privately owned companies which are mining our data to produce enormous profits for the shareholders and workers at these companies. That is not benefiting democracy. It's also, of course, important to note that even though we have been given these remarkable tools to express ourselves, that hasn't necessarily benefited democracy either. We have had, with the doing away of curation, increasing corruption of digital platforms, where without knowing who's doing the posting, these platforms have seemed to be controlled in many ways by forces that we have no idea what their agendas are, forces in Moscow or Beijing or wherever, whose interest is in pursuing their own propaganda and their own ideological interest. It's also important to note that this revolution hasn't created that kind of enlightened internationalism that was the dream of the digital founding fathers. If anything, the nature of these digital businesses lend themselves, and this has been shown time and time again by researchers, lend themselves to an echo chamber culture. So when we're on Facebook, and I know Facebook in Philippines, in Maria has explained this to me, is essentially the internet. When we're on Facebook, we congregate to those who culturally and ideologically resemble us. Not because we're necessarily conformists or uninterested in talking to other people, but because the Facebook algorithm, to suit Facebook's business interests, creates that kind of world. So we aren't talking to people of different opinions, different cultures. The ironic consequence of the digital revolution, and this is one of the most tragic elements of it, the ironic consequence is it's making us more local, more parochial, more cut off from others. And indeed, it's that kind of parochialism which is undermining civic discourse, which is one of the key reasons why we're struggling more and more to talk to one another of other opinions. The irony of the digital revolution is it's gone hand in hand with an increasing intolerance, an intolerance towards others, an intolerance of women, an intolerance of other religions, of sexualities, and above all else of political opinions. So the great tragedy of the internet and of the digital revolution to date is, for all its enlightenment potential, it's resulting in a new dark age. And then it's no coincidence then that this digital revolution is going hand in hand with this democratic recession. In an age of uncertainty, in an age where we don't trust one another anymore, and indeed the doing away with the gatekeepers and the unverifiable nature of the digital revolution has resulted in a world where government institutions are increasingly distrusted. The biggest scarcity of the digital age is not information or data, but trust. So, in an age where we trust fewer and fewer people, in an age of informational chaos, in an age where conspiracy theories run rampant on an uncurated information platform, it's no surprise that we become more and more nervous, more and more nostalgic for an age of certainty. And indeed, in a technological age where these radical new technologies are undermining many of our professions and will do more and more with the AI revolution, it's not surprising that the most powerful political currency is nostalgia. When you look at these dominant neo-authoritarian leaders, Putin pioneered it in Russia, but Trump in the United States. I'm not going to talk about Duterte because I'm not an expert on the Philippines, but you guys know more about him than I do. You can fit him in if you like. Orban in Hungary, Bolsonaro in Brazil. They're all united by one idea, that things were better in the past. They're also all united by the idea of a kind of brutal Rousseauian majoritarianism, a rejection of the rights of minorities. So it's this backward-looking nostalgia, which I think is one of the casualties of the digital age. So, a dark new age where democracies are dying, an age where we no longer know the difference between truth and propaganda, an age where the information world is controlled by a tiny group of trillion-dollar companies. Democracy hasn't benefited. Democracy is in crisis. So how are we going to fix democracy? How do we address these issues? Because we have to. Because as Larry Diamond said to me, if we don't address them now, then the deep democratic recession will become a depression. We really will go back to the 1930s, We really will go back to the age of fascism and Bolshevism, where democracy was a privilege in a tiny group of countries, and everywhere else fell under one kind of authoritarian regime or another. So how do we address this? How do we push back on the world? I think the first thing, and let's be really clear, digital is playing a role in this. But the biggest danger of all, I think, and some of you may have jumped to a conclusion that I'm a Luddite, the biggest conclusion of all is to turn against technology. Because the technology that has brought us here also has a great deal of potential. There's nothing inevitable about a winner-take-all economy. There's nothing inevitable about the internet essentially being controlled by a tiny group of internet companies based in Silicon Valley. And there's nothing inevitable about information losing its curation. We need to look into the world and recognize that the first way to reinvent democracy is to innovate it and not to fall into the trap of nostalgia, not to fall into the nostalgic ideal of 19th or 20th century democracy. Or if only we could go back to parliamentary regimes, if only we could go back to the certainties of the past. Because those are the tactics, those are the weapons of the neo-authoritarians. We need to look forward rather than backwards. Tomorrow rather than yesterday needs to be the call to action on the part of democratic activists. So how do we reinvent democracy? The first way, I think, is by beginning to address the crisis of digital platforms, the crisis of the public internet. We need to regulate or at least force the big digital companies, and I think they're willing to acknowledge their role in some of this crisis. We'll see at the panel afterwards. But we need these companies to become more transparent. These companies claim they were transparent. They fetishize the idea of transparency. But when a Silicon Valley talks about being transparent, the reality is that they're opaque. The reality is that we don't know, just as Coca-Cola, who was on the stage last time, their great value is we don't know how they make their syrup drink. And if they gave that away, then they would have no value. The same is true of Google. We have no idea how their search engine works. Because if they gave that away, then everyone could become Google. And the same is true of Facebook. We have no idea how their algorithm works. We really have no idea why certain people end up on a certain page in Facebook and why all these pages congregate together. So what we need when it comes to regulation of the platforms is not shutting them down or punishing them with billion-dollar fines. The Europeans are doing that. It's not necessarily a bad thing, because the only way to wake these companies up, which are for-profit corporations without any real ideological agenda, is by fining them, by affecting their bottom line. But we need transparency. We need to understand how these platforms work if we are to reform them, and indeed to shove these algorithms into the public space. So regulation matters, but it needs to be a creative rather than a reactionary kind of regulatory regime. We also need to address that the real reform of democracy is not going to come in the digital space. You're going to get someone who will say, oh, well, the new kind of democracy is blockchain. That's going to change everything. We've heard that kind of shit before. Doesn't work. Technology does not result in democracy. The only thing that results in democracy are people, because democracy exists for you and I, not for algorithms, not for Silicon Valley companies, not for Chinese companies. And indeed, if we don't address these issues now, the Chinese model of not surveillance capitalism, but a surveillance authoritarianism, perhaps even surveillance totalitarianism, will become an increasingly attractive model. So how do we deepen democracy? We can only do it through civic engagement. And I think the big new thing, or the new thing, of the 21st century is not going to be digital innovation, but it's going to be analog information. Because in this age of, not of destruction, but in this age of distraction, where we're increasingly separated from one another, we all feel this kind of anxiety. We all feel as if we're separated from one another. One of the ironic consequences of the domination of social media of our world is we feel less and less in contact with one another. And all the researchers are showing that the digital generation, more than any other generation in history, is not only feeling lonely and isolated, but also going through a crisis of social connectivity. So what we need to do is reinvent democracy in an analog sense. And we're already seeing the beginnings of this. We're seeing it, for example, with citizens' assemblies in Ireland and all over Europe, in which reinventing the democracy of antiquity, democracy is trying to modernize itself, reinvent itself. The old centralized democratic parliaments and infrastructures don't seem to work anymore. They don't resonate in the 21st century. What the citizens' assemblies are doing is, through lottery, involving ordinary citizens in the politics of their community. Politics, in my view, will make a major comeback in the 21st century because of all the huge challenges of our age, from environmental issues to digital issues to issues of war and peace. But they're not going to come through digital. They're going to come through innovative analog strategies. And citizen assemblies are one example. So we need, if we are to fix democracy, we need to harness and control and civilize the digital revolution. But we can't assume that that will work without analog. Is there a model that we can look to? In my work, I've spent a lot of time in Estonia. I think the Estonians, with their pioneering of e-democracy, is a really interesting model. Because what the Estonians have done is recognize that we need to, rewrite the social contract in the digital age. One of the great mistakes of the early digital revolution was to fetishize anonymity, was to fetishize the idea that we could go online and no one would know who we were. And if we had to reveal who we were, that would undermine our rights, that would undermine democracy. The reality, of course, the reason why the internet has turned into this horrible machinery of propagandists, into Cambridge Analytica, into a tool for Putin and his trolls in Moscow and St. Petersburg, is because we have no real idea who's online. What the Estonians have done in their innovative practices is say to the citizens, you can't be anonymous online, but you also have rights that people can't look at your information, your health information, your banking information, your citizen information without you knowing it. So we need to, in the digital 21st century, rewrite the social contract. I think anonymity is a huge curse. I think if we can do away with anonymity, then we can begin to rebuild democracy. And of course, ultimately it comes down to all of us. Ultimately, we need to learn to be responsible, not to insult, not to propagandize. And I think that will only come, just as we look at each other as physical people in a place like this, that will only eventually be realized if we can do away with anonymity. So, a new social contract, new ways of reinventing democracy through analog, and a more creative and responsible regulatory attitude towards to big social media and internet companies. I think those three things together will represent a beginning. But there is no easy fix. There's no app to fix democracy. It won't happen overnight. This is the great challenge of the early part of the 21st century, and we all have a responsibility to be involved. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Andrew Keen.